My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I'm 34 years old. 3 days ago, I stood outside St. Mary's Cathedral watching my own mother's funeral through the rain-streaked windows, banned from entering by my own family. What happened next exposed. 20 years of lies, manipulation, and a truth so shocking that it changed everything I thought I knew about the people who raised me. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up in the suburbs of Portland, Oregon, I always believed I lived in a loving, if complicated, household. My mother, Linda Mitchell, was a gentle soul who worked as a nurse at the local children's hospital. She had this incredible ability to make anyone feel heard and valued, whether it was a scared child getting their first vaccination or a neighbor going through a difficult divorce. Mom was the kind of person who remembered birthdays, sent handwritten thank you notes, and always had a pot of coffee ready for unexpected visitors. My father, Robert Mitchell, owned a small but successful plumbing business that he'd built from nothing. He was hardworking and practical, the type of man who could fix anything with his hands but struggled to express emotions with words. Dad believed in earning your keep and taking responsibility for your actions. He taught me how to change a tire, balance a checkbook, and stand up for myself when others tried to take advantage. Then there was my younger sister, Jessica. 2 years my junior, she was everything I wasn't. Where I was serious and studious, Jessica was spontaneous and charming. She had this magnetic personality that drew people to her like moths to a flame. Teachers loved her despite her mediocre grades. Friends flocked to her despite her tendency to be unreliable. And boys followed her around like lovesick puppies despite her habit of breaking hearts without a second thought. The three of them formed what I now realize was a tight-knit unit that I was perpetually on the outside of. It wasn't obvious at first. In fact, for most of my childhood, I thought we were just a normal family with the usual sibling dynamics. Jessica was the baby, so naturally she got more attention. Jessica was more social, so naturally she had more friends over. Jessica was more dramatic, so naturally her problems seemed more urgent. I threw myself into academics and extracurricular activities, partly because I genuinely enjoyed learning, but also because achievement felt like the only way to earn recognition in our household. I was valedictorian of my high school class, captain of the debate team, and editor of the school newspaper. My parents attended my graduation and smiled for photos, but I remember feeling like they were going through the motions rather than celebrating genuine pride in my accomplishments. Jessica, meanwhile, barely graduated. She was too busy dating the quarterback, organizing parties, and getting into the kind of harmless trouble that somehow made her seem more interesting rather than irresponsible. When she walked across that stage 2 years after me, my parents cheered like she'd just won a Nobel Prize. The disparity in their reactions was stark, but I told myself it was because Jessica's graduation was more of a surprise than mine. After high school, I received a full scholarship to Oregon State University, where I studied business administration with a focus on nonprofit management. I'd always been drawn to the idea of helping others, inspired by my mother's work at the Oxa Hospital and her natural compassion for people in need. I worked part-time throughout college, not because my family couldn't afford to support me, but because I wanted to contribute to my own education and build work experience. During my sophomore year, I started volunteering at a local animal shelter, which led to a paid position managing their adoption programs. The work was challenging but fulfilling, and I discovered I had a talent for organization, fundraising, and connecting with both animals and the people who wanted to give them homes. My supervisors consistently praised my dedication and innovative approaches to increasing adoption rates while reducing overhead costs. Jessica chose a very different path. She enrolled at Portland Community College with the vague intention of studying something related to fashion or art, but she changed her major 3 times and dropped out after 2 years. Instead of pursuing traditional education, she decided she wanted to be an influencer, spending her days creating content for social media platforms and her evenings attending networking events and parties. To my surprise, her approach actually worked to some extent. She built a modest following posting about lifestyle topics, beauty routines, and relationship advice. While she wasn't making significant money from her online presence, she managed to secure occasional sponsorship deals and free products from various companies. My parents viewed this as entrepreneurial success and frequently bragged to neighbors about Jessica's modern approach to building a career. Meanwhile, my academic achievements and professional growth seemed to generate polite acknowledgement at best. When I graduated summa cum laude and immediately landed a position as program coordinator at the Northwest Children's Foundation, my parents attended the small celebration dinner I organized, but spent most of the evening asking Jessica about her latest collaboration with a local makeup brand. The foundation job was exactly what I'd hoped for. I worked with families facing medical crises, helping them navigate insurance systems, connecting them with financial assistance programs, and coordinating care between multiple healthcare providers. The work was emotionally demanding, but incredibly meaningful. I was making a real difference in people's lives during their most vulnerable moments, and my supervisors quickly recognized my potential for leadership. Within 3 years, I'd been promoted twice and was managing a team of 6 coordinators. My salary had increased substantially, allowing me to move into a comfortable apartment near downtown Portland and start building a solid financial foundation. I was contributing regularly to retirement accounts, had established an emergency fund, and was even considering purchasing a small condo. Jessica, at 24, was still living at home with our parents. Her influencer career had plateaued, and the sporadic income from sponsorships wasn't enough to support independent living. Rather than encouraging her to find supplemental employment or develop more practical skills, our parents seemed content to provide housing, food, and spending money while Jessica pursued her passion projects. When I suggested during a family dinner that Jessica might benefit from taking some business courses or finding part-time work to build financial stability, my mother gently scolded me for being unsupportive of my sister's creative pursuits. Dad nodded in agreement, saying that not everyone needed to follow the same traditional path to success, and that Jessica's happiness was more important than conventional achievements. The conversation left me feeling frustrated and somewhat hurt. I'd followed exactly the kind of traditional path they seemed to value, working hard, achieving measurable success, and building financial independence. Yet somehow Jessica's undefined creative exploration was viewed as equally valid, even though it required ongoing financial support from our parents who were approaching retirement age. Around this time, I began dating Michael, a pediatric nurse I'd met through work connections. He was kind, stable, and shared my values about helping others and building a secure future together. Michael came from a large, boisterous family where everyone was expected to contribute and support each other, but where achievements were also celebrated enthusiastically and equally. Spending time with his family highlighted the subtle but persistent imbalances in my own. When Michael and I became engaged after 2 years of dating, I was excited to share the news with my parents. I'd imagined my mother helping me plan the wedding, going dress shopping together, and having those special mother-daughter moments I'd seen in movies and heard friends describe. Instead, her reaction was warm but restrained, and within minutes of congratulating us, she was asking whether we'd considered timing the wedding around Jessica's schedule. Jessica had recently started dating someone she'd met through her social media work, a photographer named Kyle, who traveled frequently for various projects. Mom was concerned that our wedding might conflict with Kyle's schedule or with some of Jessica's content creation commitments. The suggestion that my wedding timeline should accommodate my sister's boyfriend's work schedule and her hobby felt absurd, but I tried to be understanding. Planning the wedding became a series of compromises that always seemed to favor everyone else's convenience over our preferences. The venue I loved was too far for some of Jessica's friends to travel. The date Michael and I preferred conflicted with a family friend's anniversary party that Jessica wanted to attend. The budget we'd established wasn't sufficient for all the extras that Mom thought were necessary to properly welcome Jessica's new relationship and social circle. Michael was incredibly patient throughout the planning process, but I could see his growing confusion about my family's dynamics. His parents had immediately welcomed me as a daughter, including me in family traditions and seeking my opinions on family decisions. They treated my achievements with genuine pride, and my relationship with Michael as something to be celebrated and supported. The contrast became even more apparent during wedding planning meetings. Michael's mother would ask detailed questions about my work, my goals, and my thoughts on various wedding decisions. My mother would listen politely, but then redirect conversations to Jessica's latest projects, Kyle's artistic vision, or concerns about whether certain wedding choices might overshadow Jessica's own future wedding plans. 6 months before our wedding date, Jessica announced she and Kyle were engaged. They'd been dating for less than a year, and Kyle had proposed during a spontaneous weekend trip to the coast. The proposal story was admittedly romantic, involving a surprise sunset photo shoot that ended with Kyle getting down on one knee while the photographer captured the moment. The family's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Mom cried happy. Tears. Dad opened a bottle of champagne he'd been saving for a special occasion, and everyone spent the evening looking at the engagement photos and discussing preliminary wedding ideas. The energy and enthusiasm were infectious, and I found myself genuinely excited for Jessica, despite feeling a bit overshadowed. What bothered me wasn't that they were happy for Jessica, but the stark difference in the intensity of their celebration compared to their reaction to my engagement. When Michael had proposed, we'd received congratulations and a nice dinner out, but nothing approaching the level of excitement and immediate family involvement that Jessica's engagement generated. Over the following weeks, it became clear that Jessica and Kyle were planning a wedding that would take place just 2 months after ours. This timeline meant that much of the focus during my final months of wedding planning was actually on Jessica's upcoming engagement party, dress shopping, and vendor selections. Family conversations increasingly centered on her wedding rather than mine, and several vendors we'd considered ended up being booked for Jessica's event instead. I tried to be gracious about the overlapping timelines, understanding that Jessica had always been more impulsive and that Kyle's travel schedule created constraints on their planning. However, it was difficult not to feel like my own wedding was being treated as a preliminary event leading up to the main attraction of Jessica's celebration. My wedding day was beautiful, despite the various compromises we'd made along the way. Michael and I exchanged vows in a ceremony that felt meaningful and personal, surrounded by people we loved. My parents were present and appropriately supportive, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were already mentally preparing for Jessica's wedding rather than fully celebrating ours. The reception was lovely, though I noticed that much of the conversation among family members focused on comparisons to Jessica's upcoming wedding or discussions about lessons learned for her event. Several relatives made comments about how Jessica's wedding would probably be even more spectacular, or how certain elements of our reception were giving them ideas for her celebration. Michael and I honeymooned in Ireland, a trip we'd planned carefully and saved for over many months. When we returned, Jessica's wedding preparations were in full swing, and it was clear that this event was receiving a level of attention and financial investment that far exceeded what had been allocated for ours. Jessica's wedding was indeed spectacular. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She and Kyle had chosen a vineyard venue with stunning views, hired a well-known photographer, and planned multiple events including an engagement party, rehearsal dinner, and post-wedding brunch. The guest list was extensive, including many of Jessica's social media connections and Kyle's artistic colleagues from around the country. My parents had clearly spent significantly more on Jessica's wedding than they had contributed to mine, though they never explicitly discussed the financial details. The difference was obvious in everything from the venue selection to the floral arrangements to the quality of the catering. When I mentioned the disparity to Michael, he was supportive, but encouraged me not to dwell on comparisons that would only create resentment. After both weddings were over, I hoped family dynamics might return to a more balanced state. Michael and I settled into married life, both thriving in our respective careers and beginning to discuss plans for the future, including the possibility of starting a family. I'd been promoted again at the foundation and was now overseeing multiple programs with a substantial budget and staff. Jessica and Kyle moved into a trendy apartment in downtown Portland, financed primarily by my parents and Kyle's irregular photography income. Jessica's social media following had grown somewhat due to wedding content, but she still wasn't generating enough revenue to support herself independently. Kyle's artistic pursuits were respected by the family, but his income was unpredictable and insufficient for their lifestyle. Rather than encouraging the newlyweds to adjust their spending or find additional income sources, my parents continued, providing financial support. They covered the security deposit for Jessica's apartment, helped with monthly rent when Kyle's bookings were slow, and regularly treated them to expensive dinners and entertainment. When Michael and I mentioned that we were starting to look at houses, hoping to build equity instead of paying rent, my parents were supportive in theory but didn't offer any financial assistance. They explained that they believed we were capable of managing our own finances and didn't need help the way Jessica and Kyle did. The reasoning made sense on the surface, but it felt like another example of my competence being used to justify different treatment. During this period, my mother began experiencing health issues that would ultimately change everything about our family dynamics. It started with small things that were easy to dismiss: forgetting appointments, repeating stories, misplacing important documents. Mom had always been incredibly organized and detail-oriented, so these lapses seemed out of character, but we attributed them to stress from work and the busy period of planning 2 weddings. As months passed, the symptoms became more concerning. Mom would forget conversations we'd had just days earlier, become confused about dates and times, and occasionally seem disoriented even in familiar environments. She started having difficulty managing her responsibilities at the hospital, making mistakes that were completely unlike her usual careful approach to patient care. I was the first to suggest that she see a doctor for a comprehensive evaluation. Dad was resistant, insisting that Mom was just tired and needed a vacation. Jessica was largely absent from these discussions, focusing on her own life and seemingly unaware of the subtle changes in our mother's behavior. When I finally convinced Mom to schedule an appointment with her primary care physician, I offered to accompany her, knowing that she might not remember all the questions or accurately report her symptoms. She accepted my offer gratefully, and I took time off work to attend the appointment with her. The initial consultation led to referrals for more specialized testing, including cognitive assessments and brain imaging. Throughout this process, I continued to be Mom's primary source of support, helping her navigate the medical system I'd become familiar with through my work at the foundation. Dad attended some appointments but seemed overwhelmed by the technical information and potential implications. Jessica's involvement was minimal and sporadic. She would express concern when directly asked about Mom's condition, but she didn't offer practical assistance or emotional support. When I mentioned that Mom might benefit from having family members take turns accompanying her to appointments or helping with daily tasks, Jessica explained that her schedule was too unpredictable and that medical environments made her uncomfortable. The diagnosis, when it finally came, was devastating. Early-onset Alzheimer's disease, with symptoms likely to progress steadily over the coming years. Mom was only 58 years old, far younger than the typical age for such a diagnosis, but the medical evidence was clear. The doctors explained treatment options, support resources, and the importance of planning for progressive care needs. I immediately began researching everything I could about Alzheimer's disease, connecting with support groups, and investigating local resources for families dealing with this diagnosis. I used my professional network to identify the best specialists in the region and began coordinating Mom's care team to ensure she would receive comprehensive support. Dad was struggling to process the diagnosis and its implications. He'd always relied on Mom for emotional support and household management, and the prospect of her progressive decline left him feeling lost and afraid. I stepped in to help him understand the medical information, navigate insurance systems, and begin making practical adjustments to their living situation. Jessica's response to the diagnosis was emotional, but not particularly constructive. She would cry when discussing Mom's condition, but didn't translate that emotion into helpful action. When I created a schedule for family members to spend time with Mom and assist with daily activities, Jessica's contributions were inconsistent and often canceled at the last minute due to other commitments. As Mom's condition progressed over the following months, I became her primary caregiver and advocate. I was the one who accompanied her to medical appointments, managed her medications, helped her maintain her daily routines, and provided emotional support as she struggled with the reality of her diagnosis. This caregiving role was in addition to my full-time job, which I was trying to maintain at a high level of performance despite the increased personal demands on my time and energy. Michael was incredibly supportive, helping with practical tasks and providing emotional support as I navigated this challenging period. The financial implications of Mom's care needs were significant and became a source of family tension. The medications, specialist appointments, and support services required substantial resources that weren't fully covered by insurance. I began contributing my own money to ensure Mom received the best possible care, viewing it as both a practical necessity and an expression of my love for her. Dad's plumbing business was successful but not extremely lucrative, and he was approaching retirement age with limited savings. The prospect of funding years of specialized care for Mom while maintaining their household was daunting. I offered to help with the financial burden, increasing my contributions and researching additional resources and assistance programs. Jessica and Kyle, meanwhile, continued to receive financial support from my parents for their own expenses. Even as Mom's care needs created budget constraints, my parents were reluctant to ask Jessica to become more financially independent. When I suggested that this might be an appropriate time for everyone to contribute to Mom's care costs, the conversation was uncomfortable and ultimately unproductive. The disparity in expectations became increasingly clear over time. I was expected to contribute both time and money to Mom's care while maintaining my career and marriage. Jessica was expected to visit occasionally and provide emotional support, while continuing to receive financial assistance for her own lifestyle. The difference in these expectations reflected the same patterns I'd observed throughout our lives, but now the stakes were much higher. As Mom's condition deteriorated, requiring more intensive care and supervision, I began researching memory care facilities that could provide specialized support. The costs were substantial, but I wanted to ensure Mom would be safe, comfortable, and well cared for as her needs exceeded what we could provide at home. Finding and evaluating these facilities became another responsibility I took on largely alone. Dad was emotionally overwhelmed by the prospect of moving Mom out of their home, and Jessica found the process too depressing to engage with meaningfully. I visited dozens of facilities, reviewed their programs and staff qualifications, and analyzed their financial structures to find the best possible option within a reasonable budget. When we finally selected a memory care facility that met our criteria for quality and affordability, I handled most of the application process, financial arrangements, and transition planning. The monthly costs were significant, requiring contributions from Dad's business income, their savings, and supplemental funds that I provided to bridge the gap. Throughout this period, I also took on the responsibility of managing Mom's legal affairs, working with an elder law attorney to establish power of attorney documents, update her will, and create healthcare directives. These were complex and emotionally challenging conversations, but they were necessary to protect Mom's interests and ensure her wishes would be respected. The move to the memory care facility was heartbreaking but necessary. Mom's condition had progressed to the point where she needed constant supervision and specialized care that we couldn't safely provide at home. I coordinated the move, helped her settle into her new environment, and established routines for regular visits and ongoing involvement in her care. Dad visited Mom regularly, but found the experience emotionally difficult. Seeing her confusion and progressive decline was painful for him, and he often left visits feeling sad and helpless. I tried to support him through this adjustment while maintaining my own visiting schedule and continuing to coordinate Mom's care team. Jessica's visits were infrequent and brief. She would arrive with good intentions, but seemed overwhelmed by Mom's condition and the institutional environment. Her visits often ended abruptly when she became emotional or uncomfortable, leaving me to provide the consistent presence and emotional support that Mom needed. The financial burden of Mom's care continued to grow as her needs became more complex. In addition to the basic monthly fees for the memory care facility, there were costs for specialized therapies, medical equipment, and additional services. I increased my financial contributions steadily, viewing Mom's care as the highest priority for my resources. During this time, Michael and I had been discussing starting a family, but the demands of Mom's care and the associated financial costs made us postpone these plans. We wanted to ensure we could provide properly for both Mom's needs and our future children's needs without creating financial stress that might affect our marriage or family stability. The irony wasn't lost on me that my parents had always emphasized the importance of financial responsibility and planning for the future, yet I was the only family member making significant financial sacrifices to ensure Mom received proper care. Jessica and Kyle continued to receive financial support for their lifestyle while contributing minimally to Mom's care costs. 2 years after Mom's initial diagnosis, her condition had progressed significantly. She no longer recognized family members consistently, required assistance with all daily activities, and had periods of agitation and confusion that were difficult for everyone involved. The medical team explained that this level of decline was expected given her diagnosis, but experiencing it was still heartbreaking. Despite these challenges, I remained committed to ensuring Mom felt loved and supported. I visited her several times each week, bringing photo albums, playing her favorite music, and simply sitting with her even when she didn't recognize me. The staff at the memory care facility consistently praised my dedication and noted that Mom seemed calmer and more content after my visits. Dad's visits became less frequent as Mom's condition worsened. He explained that seeing her so confused and different from the woman he'd married was too painful to bear regularly. I understood his emotional struggle, but wished he could find ways to maintain connection with Mom despite her changed condition. Jessica's involvement continued to be minimal and sporadic. She would visit occasionally, usually around holidays or special occasions, but her discomfort with Mom's condition was obvious. She would stay for brief periods, often becoming emotional and leaving quickly when Mom didn't recognize her or seemed agitated. The medical team began discussing end-of-life planning as Mom's condition continued to deteriorate. These conversations were difficult but necessary, covering topics like comfort care preferences, medical interventions, and family involvement in decision-making. I took the lead in these discussions, ensuring that Mom's previously expressed wishes were documented and that appropriate plans were in place. Throughout this period, I'd maintained detailed records of all expenses related to Mom's care, both as a practical matter for tax purposes and because I wanted transparency about the financial investments being made. The total amount I'd contributed over 2 years was substantial, representing a significant portion of my income and most of my savings. When I mentioned these figures to Michael during one of our regular discussions about family finances, he was surprised by the total amount. We'd been tracking my contributions month by month, but seeing the cumulative figure highlighted the extent of my financial commitment. Michael was supportive of my choices, but worried about the impact on our own future financial security. I reassured him that I viewed this spending as both necessary and meaningful. Mom had always been there for me, even if the family dynamics hadn't always been perfectly balanced. Ensuring she received quality care during her illness felt like the right thing to do, regardless of what other family members were contributing. As Mom's third year in memory care began, her physical health started declining in addition to her cognitive symptoms. She was losing weight despite the facility's best efforts, becoming more susceptible to infections, and spending increasing amounts of time sleeping. The medical team explained that these changes often indicated progression toward the final stages of the disease. These developments prompted more frequent family meetings with Mom's care team to discuss comfort measures and end-of-life preferences. I continued to be the primary family representative in these discussions, making decisions based on Mom's previously expressed wishes and consulting with Dad when he felt able to participate. Jessica's engagement in these conversations was limited. She would attend some meetings but often became emotional and unable to focus on the practical decisions that needed to be made. While I understood that discussing end-of-life care was difficult for everyone, the burden of making these important decisions fell primarily on me. The final months of Mom's life were marked by a gradual decline that was both expected and heartbreaking. She required increasing levels of medical care, slept most of the time, and had very few moments of apparent awareness or recognition. The CBA staff continued to provide excellent care, ensuring she was comfortable and treating her with dignity despite her condition. During this period, I spent even more time at the facility, often sitting with Mom for hours even when she was sleeping. I wanted to ensure she wasn't alone, and I found comfort in being present even when communication was no longer possible. The staff members often commented on my dedication and expressed appreciation for my consistent involvement in Mom's care. Dad visited occasionally during these final months, but the experience was clearly difficult for him. He would sit quietly, for short periods, sometimes holding Mom's hand, but rarely staying long. I understood that watching Mom's decline was painful for him, but I also felt the weight of being her primary emotional support during this crucial time. Jessica's visits became even less frequent as Mom's condition worsened. She explained that seeing Mom in such a deteriorated state was too distressing, and that she preferred to remember Mom as she was before the illness. While I could understand this perspective, it meant that the responsibility for maintaining family presence during Mom's final weeks fell almost entirely on me. The call came on a Tuesday morning in early spring. Mom had passed away peacefully, in her sleep, with the night staff present to ensure she wasn't alone. I immediately drove to the facility to be with her and to begin the process of notifying family members and making necessary arrangements. Standing beside Mom's bed, looking at her peaceful expression, I felt a complex mix of grief, relief, and profound sadness. The woman who had raised me, taught me to be compassionate, and inspired my career in helping others was gone. But I also felt grateful that her suffering was over and that she'd been well cared for throughout her illness. Over the following hours, I contacted Dad and Jessica with the news, spoke with the facility staff about immediate arrangements, and began the process of planning Mom's funeral. Even in the midst of my grief, I found myself taking charge of the practical details because that's what needed to be done, and what I'd always done for our family. What I couldn't have anticipated was that planning Mom's funeral would expose the deepest and most painful truths about my family's dynamics, leading to revelations that would change everything I thought I understood about love, loyalty, and what it really means to honor someone's memory. The morning after Mom's death, I woke up early and drove to Dad's house to begin discussing funeral arrangements. I'd spent most of the previous evening making preliminary calls to funeral homes, gathering information about services and costs, and creating a basic timeline for the arrangements that would need to be made over the coming days. When I arrived at Dad's house, I found him sitting at the kitchen table with Jessica and Kyle, who had apparently come over the night before to offer support. They were having coffee and speaking in hushed tones, falling silent when I walked in. The atmosphere felt strangely formal, not like the grieving family gathering I'd expected. Dad looked exhausted and older than I'd ever seen him. His eyes were red-rimmed, and his usual neat appearance was disheveled. Jessica had been crying, her makeup smudged and her hair pulled back carelessly. Kyle sat beside her, his arm around her shoulders, looking uncomfortable to be present during such an intimate family moment. I sat down at the table and pulled out the folder of information I'd gathered about funeral homes and service options. Over the years of managing Mom's care, I'd become accustomed to taking charge of difficult situations, and planning her funeral felt like a natural extension of that responsibility. Dad accepted my offer to coordinate the arrangements with obvious relief. He admitted that he felt overwhelmed by the decisions that needed to be made and appreciated having someone take charge of the details. Jessica nodded in agreement, saying she was too emotional to handle practical matters and was grateful I was willing to manage everything. We discussed Mom's preferences for her funeral service, which she'd outlined in conversations we'd had during the early stages of her illness when she was still able to communicate clearly about her wishes. She'd wanted a traditional service at St. Mary's Cathedral, where she'd attended church regularly for decades, followed by burial in the family plot at Riverside Cemetery. I explained that I'd already spoken with Father Martinez at St. Mary's, who had known Mom for years and was honored to officiate her service. We'd tentatively scheduled the funeral for Saturday, giving us time to notify extended family and friends while not delaying unnecessarily. The burial would follow immediately after the church service. Jessica asked about the reception after the burial, suggesting we host something at Dad's house where Mom's friends and extended family could gather to share memories and support each other. I thought this was a lovely idea and offered to coordinate the catering and logistics, knowing that Dad wasn't in any condition to manage hosting duties. As we discussed these arrangements, I mentioned that I'd already spoken with Morrison Funeral Home, which had an excellent reputation and reasonable pricing. I'd scheduled an appointment for that afternoon to finalize the details and select a casket, and I invited Dad and Jessica to come with me to make these important decisions together. Dad immediately agreed, saying he trusted my judgment about funeral homes and wanted my support during what he knew would be a difficult appointment. Jessica hesitated, explaining that she found funeral homes deeply unsettling and wasn't sure she could handle seeing caskets and discussing burial details so soon after Mom's death. I assured her that her feelings were completely understandable and that Dad and I could handle the funeral home appointment if she preferred. What mattered most was that we honored Mom's memory with a service that reflected her values and brought comfort to the people who loved her. That afternoon, Dad and I met with the funeral director, Margaret Collins, who had been highly recommended by Father Martinez. She was professional, compassionate, and experienced in helping families navigate their grief while making necessary practical decisions. Margaret had actually known Mom through community volunteer work and spoke warmly about her kindness and dedication to helping others. The process of selecting a casket was emotionally difficult but important. Dad and I chose a beautiful mahogany casket with simple, elegant lines that reflected Mom's taste and personality. Margaret explained the various service options available and helped us coordinate timing with the church and cemetery. When we discussed pricing, I was prepared to cover the funeral expenses, viewing this as my final gift to Mom and a way to ensure she received the dignified service she deserved. The total cost was substantial, including the casket, burial vault, cemetery fees, and various service charges, but I'd been setting aside money specifically for this purpose. Dad initially protested when I offered to pay for everything, saying it wasn't my responsibility and that he should handle his wife's funeral expenses. I explained that I wanted to do this for Mom, and that managing her care had been my way of showing love during her illness. Paying for her funeral felt like a natural continuation of that commitment. Margaret was discreet about the financial arrangements, focusing on ensuring we had everything we needed for a meaningful service while respecting our family's decision-making process. She provided detailed documentation of all costs and services, which I reviewed carefully before authorizing payment. Over the following days, I threw myself into coordinating every aspect of Mom's funeral. I worked with Father Martinez to plan the liturgy, selecting readings and hymns that had been meaningful to Mom throughout her life. I contacted extended family members and Mom's friends to notify them of the service, providing details about timing and location. The flower arrangements required coordination with multiple vendors to ensure the church would be beautifully decorated with Mom's favorite flowers, white lilies and pink roses. I also arranged for a memorial table at the church entrance where people could sign a guest book and view photographs spanning Mom's life from childhood through her nursing career and family milestones. Jessica helped with some of these tasks, particularly gathering photographs and writing a brief biography for the memorial table. She had a good eye for visual presentation and created a lovely display that captured Mom's personality and interests. However, most of the logistical coordination fell to me, which felt natural given my organizational skills and professional experience. Throughout this planning process, I was also managing my own grief while trying to support Dad through his loss. He was struggling significantly, alternating between periods of deep sadness and apparent numbness. I made sure he was eating regularly, helped him with daily tasks that seemed overwhelming, and provided emotional support when he needed to talk about Mom or express his fears about the future. The day before the funeral, I spent hours at the church working with the florist and Father Martinez to ensure everything was arranged perfectly. The sanctuary looked beautiful, filled with flowers and soft lighting that created an atmosphere of peace and reverence. The memorial table was positioned where people could view it easily, and programs had been printed with Mom's photograph and information about her life. That evening, we held a small family viewing at the funeral home for immediate family members who wanted a private opportunity to say goodbye. Dad, Jessica, Kyle, and I gathered in the quiet viewing room where Mom looked peaceful and dignified. The funeral home staff had done an excellent job, and Mom looked like herself, wearing the blue dress she'd always loved and the pearl necklace Dad had given her for their 20th anniversary. Dad spent a long time beside the casket, holding Mom's hand and speaking to her quietly. I couldn't hear his words, but I could see the love and sadness in his expression. Jessica cried openly, telling Mom how much she would miss her and apologizing for not visiting more during her illness. Kyle stood respectfully nearby, clearly moved by the family's grief, even though he hadn't known Mom well. When it was my turn to say goodbye privately, I told Mom about all the arrangements I'd made for her service, describing the flowers, music, and readings we'd selected. I thanked her for teaching me to be strong and compassionate, and I promised to take care of Dad and continue helping people through my work, carrying forward the values she'd instilled in me. Leaving the funeral home that night was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. It felt like a final goodbye, even though I knew I'd see Mom again at the funeral service. Dad was quiet during the drive home, lost in his own thoughts and memories. I stayed with him that evening, making sure he ate dinner and helping him prepare for what would undoubtedly be an emotionally exhausting day. The morning of the funeral dawned clear and mild, perfect weather for a spring service. I arrived at the church early to coordinate with Father Martinez and ensure all the arrangements were in place. The flowers had been delivered and arranged beautifully. The programs were ready for distribution, and the guest book was positioned at the memorial table. As people began arriving for the service, I was amazed by the number of Mom's friends, colleagues, and community members who came to pay their respects. Former patients from the Children's Hospital, neighbors from throughout the years, fellow church members, and extended family filled the sanctuary, creating a powerful testament to the impact Mom had made during her life. Father Martinez delivered a beautiful homily about Mom's dedication to caring for others and her quiet faith that had sustained her through life's challenges. He spoke about her work at the hospital, her devotion to family, and her courage during her illness. Several of Mom's closest friends shared memories during the service, describing her kindness, humor, and unwavering support during their own difficult times. I had prepared remarks about Mom but found myself too emotional to speak when the moment came. Instead, Jessica surprised everyone by walking to the podium and delivering a heartfelt tribute to Mom's love and sacrifice. She spoke about childhood, memories, Mom's pride in both her daughters, and the lessons she'd taught them about compassion and strength. Her words were beautiful and moving, capturing aspects of Mom's personality that resonated with everyone present. The music during the service included hymns that Mom had loved, performed by the church choir she'd supported for many years. The combination of familiar melodies and meaningful lyrics created an atmosphere of comfort and celebration of Mom's life, exactly what she would have wanted for her funeral. After the church service, we proceeded to Riverside Cemetery for the burial. The graveside service was smaller, attended primarily by family and close friends. Father Martinez offered final prayers, and we each placed flowers on the casket before it was lowered into the ground beside the plot where Dad would eventually be buried. Standing at Mom's graveside, surrounded by people who had loved her, I felt a profound sense of completion. Despite the sadness of losing her, I was grateful for the beautiful service we'd provided and the community support that had surrounded our family during this difficult time. Mom had been honored and remembered in a way that reflected her values and the love people felt for her. The reception at Dad's house following the burial was exactly what Mom would have wanted. Her friends shared stories about her kindness and humor, family members reminisced about holiday gatherings and special occasions, and former colleagues from the hospital described her dedication to her young patients. The house was filled with laughter through tears, celebrating Mom's life rather than focusing only on our loss. I moved through the gathering, ensuring everyone felt welcome, coordinating with the caterers, and making sure Dad was surrounded by support. Many people approached me to express appreciation for the beautiful service and to acknowledge the obvious care that had gone into every detail. Several of Mom's former colleagues specifically mentioned how much they'd appreciated my dedication to her care during her illness. Jessica also received many compliments for her tribute during the church service, and I was genuinely proud of her for finding the courage to speak publicly about Mom despite her emotional state. She seemed more present and engaged during the reception than she'd been throughout much of Mom's illness, connecting with extended family and Mom's friends in meaningful ways. As the reception wound down and people began leaving, I started coordinating cleanup and ensuring Dad had support for the evening. Several family members and close friends had offered to stay with him, and I was grateful he wouldn't be alone during his first night after burying his wife. Margaret from the funeral home stopped by briefly to ensure everything had gone smoothly and to provide final paperwork related to the burial and cemetery records. She complimented the service and mentioned that it was clear how much love and thought had gone into honoring Mom's memory. That evening, after everyone had left and Dad was settled with his brother who was staying overnight, I finally returned to my own home. Michael had attended the funeral and reception, providing quiet support throughout the day, but he understood that I needed some time alone to process everything that had happened. Sitting in my living room, surrounded by flowers people had sent, and cards expressing sympathy, I felt emotionally drained but also peaceful. We'd given Mom a beautiful farewell that honored her life and provided comfort to everyone who mourned her loss. The financial cost had been significant, representing most of my savings and emergency fund, but it felt like money well spent. Over the following weeks, I helped Dad begin adjusting to life without Mom. This involved practical matters like updating insurance policies and financial accounts, but also emotional support as he navigated grief and loneliness. I visited him regularly, helped with household tasks that had been Mom's responsibility, and ensured he was connecting with friends and maintaining social activities. During this period, I also received numerous thank you notes from people who had attended Mom's funeral. Many specifically mentioned the beauty of the service, the touching memorial display, and the obvious love that had gone into every detail. These messages were deeply meaningful to me, confirming that we'd honored Mom's memory in a way that brought comfort to others. Jessica's involvement in Dad's post-funeral adjustment was minimal, which wasn't entirely surprising given her historical pattern of avoiding difficult emotional situations. She called him occasionally and visited briefly every few weeks, but the day-to-day support he needed fell primarily to me. About a month after the funeral, I was organizing Mom's personal belongings when I discovered a manila envelope in her. bedroom dresser labeled with my name in her handwriting. Inside was a handwritten letter dated about 6 months before her death, during a period when she was still able to write coherently, but was beginning to experience significant memory problems. The letter began with expressions of love and gratitude for my care during her illness. Mom acknowledged that she understood how much time, energy, and money I'd invested in ensuring she received quality care, and she wanted me to know how much my dedication had meant to her. She described feeling guilty that her illness had required such sacrifice from me, while Jessica continued to receive financial support from Dad. More surprising was Mom's revelation that she'd been saving money for several years, setting aside small amounts from her nursing salary and occasional gifts from family members. She'd accumulated about $15,000 in a separate account that Dad didn't know about, money she'd intended to use for a special vacation or home improvement project before her diagnosis changed everything. The letter explained that she wanted this money to go to me, both as recognition of my caregiving efforts and as a small repayment for the financial contributions I'd made to her care. She'd updated her will to include this bequest, working with an attorney during one of her more lucid periods to ensure the documentation was legally valid. Reading Mom's words of appreciation and love was both comforting and heartbreaking. She'd recognized the imbalance in family contributions and had taken steps to acknowledge my sacrifice in a tangible way. The letter also included expressions of hope that Jessica would become more responsible and self-sufficient as she matured, and wishes that our family would find better balance in the future. I decided not to mention the letter to Dad or Jessica immediately, wanting time to process Mom's words and consider how to handle this unexpected inheritance. The money would certainly help replenish my savings after the substantial funeral expenses. But more importantly, the letter provided confirmation that Mom had seen and appreciated my efforts during her illness. Several weeks later, I met with Mom's attorney to discuss the inheritance and ensure all legal requirements were met for transferring the funds. The attorney mentioned that Mom had been very specific about wanting this bequest to remain private, unless I chose to share the information with other family members. During our conversation, the attorney also revealed that Mom had expressed concerns about Jessica's financial dependence on Dad and had hoped that her death might prompt Jessica to become more self-sufficient. Mom had worried that continuing to support Jessica indefinitely wasn't helping her develop necessary life skills and was creating stress for Dad as he approached retirement. These insights into Mom's thoughts during her final coherent months were both validating and sad. She'd observed the same family dynamics that had troubled me for years, but had felt unable to address them directly due to her illness and Dad's protective instincts toward Jessica. I decided to keep Mom's inheritance private for the time being, using the money to rebuild my savings and continue supporting Dad's adjustment to widowhood. The letter itself became a treasured possession, providing comfort during difficult moments and serving as a reminder of Mom's love and recognition of my efforts. About 2 months after Mom's death, I noticed changes in Dad's behavior that initially seemed like normal grief responses, but gradually became more concerning. He was becoming increasingly isolated, declining invitations from friends and avoiding social activities he'd previously enjoyed. His eating habits were poor, and he seemed to be losing weight steadily. When I expressed concern about his withdrawal and suggested he might benefit from grief counseling or support groups, Dad became defensive and insisted he was managing fine on his own. He claimed he just needed time to adjust and that he preferred solitude while processing his loss. Jessica seemed largely unaware of Dad's declining emotional state, focused on her own life and apparently assuming that my regular visits meant he was receiving adequate support. When I mentioned my concerns to her, she dismissed them as normal grief reactions and suggested I was being overly protective. My worry intensified when I discovered that Dad had stopped maintaining basic household routines. His home was becoming cluttered and dirty, bills were going unpaid despite adequate finances, and he seemed confused about daily tasks that had never been challenging for him. These changes suggested something beyond normal grief. After consulting, With my physician contacts through work, I convinced Dad to schedule a comprehensive health evaluation, ostensibly to address his weight loss and energy problems. The assessment revealed that he was indeed experiencing depression severe enough to affect his cognitive function and daily living skills. The physician recommended therapy and medication to address Dad's depression, along with regular monitoring, to ensure he was managing safely on his own. I coordinated these services and began checking on him more frequently, ensuring he was taking prescribed medications and maintaining basic self-care routines. During this period, Jessica's involvement remained minimal despite my requests for additional family support. She would visit occasionally but seemed uncomfortable with Dad's emotional state and typically kept these visits brief. Her lack of practical assistance meant that the responsibility for Dad's well-being fell almost entirely on me. The demands of supporting Dad through his depression while maintaining my own career and marriage created significant stress. Michael was understanding and helpful, but I could see the strain affecting our relationship and our plans for the future. We'd postponed discussions about starting a family due to the ongoing family crises, and our financial resources were being directed towards supporting Dad, rather than building our own security. 3 months after Mom's funeral, I received an unexpected phone call from Father Martinez at St. Mary's Cathedral. He explained that he'd been contacted by the cemetery administration about an outstanding balance on Mom's burial expenses. According to their records, a significant portion of the cemetery fees had not been paid, and they were seeking resolution before proceeding with the permanent headstone installation. I was confused by this information since I'd paid all the funeral and burial costs directly and had documentation showing the transactions had been completed. I immediately contacted Morrison Funeral Home to clarify the situation and review my payment records. Margaret Collins at the funeral home was equally puzzled by the cemetery's claim. She reviewed our account and confirmed that I had indeed paid all funeral home charges in full, including the cemetery fees that Morrison had handled on our behalf. She suggested there might be an administrative error and offered to contact the cemetery directly to resolve the confusion. Over the following days, the situation became increasingly complicated as various parties tried to determine what had happened to the cemetery payments. The funeral home maintained that they had forwarded appropriate funds to the cemetery, while the cemetery insisted they had only received partial payment for Mom's burial plot and services. During this investigation, I discovered something troubling. According to cemetery records, someone had contacted them shortly after Mom's burial to modify the payment arrangements and request a refund of a portion of the fees. This person had identified themselves as a family member authorized to make financial decisions on behalf of the estate. When I asked for more details about this contact, the cemetery administrator was reluctant to provide specific information, citing privacy policies. However, they eventually confirmed that the person who had requested the payment modification was not me, and that this had resulted in an outstanding balance that needed to be resolved before the headstone could be installed. The implication was deeply disturbing. Someone in my family had apparently tried to reclaim money that I had paid for Mom's burial expenses, creating a financial problem that threatened to delay or prevent the installation of her permanent headstone. This felt like a betrayal not only of me, but of Mom's memory and the dignity of her burial. I immediately scheduled a meeting with the cemetery administrator to review all documentation and determine exactly what had happened. Armed with my own payment records and copies of all funeral arrangements, I was prepared to resolve the financial issue regardless of how it had occurred. The meeting revealed the full scope of what had happened. 3 weeks after Mom's burial, Jessica had contacted the cemetery claiming that there had been an error in the payment arrangements. She had explained that the family had decided to handle cemetery fees differently and had requested a partial refund of the money I had paid. Jessica had apparently convinced the cemetery staff that she was authorized to make these changes, providing personal information about Mom and the burial arrangements that gave her request credibility. The cemetery had processed a partial refund, creating the outstanding balance that was now preventing the headstone installation. I was stunned by this revelation. Jessica had not only attempted to reclaim money I had spent on Mom's burial, but had done so without any consultation with me or Dad. Her actions had created a financial problem that could have resulted in Mom's grave remaining unmarked indefinitely if I hadn't been contacted about the outstanding balance. The cemetery administrator was apologetic about the confusion and explained that they would reverse the unauthorized refund and reinstate the original payment arrangements. However, the incident had delayed the headstone installation by several weeks and had created unnecessary stress during an already difficult time. When I confronted Jessica about her actions, her response was defensive and confusing. She claimed that she had been trying to help manage family expenses and had thought there was some kind of billing error that needed to be corrected. She insisted that she hadn't intended to create problems and that she was just trying to be helpful. Her explanation made no sense given the specific nature of her request and the fact that she had never been involved in managing any aspect of Mom's funeral expenses. When I pressed her for a clearer explanation, she became emotional and accused me of being controlling about family financial matters. The conversation escalated when Jessica revealed that she felt I had been excluding her from important family decisions by handling all of Mom's care and funeral arrangements without adequate consultation. She claimed that she should have been more involved in these decisions and that my taking charge of everything had made her feel marginalized and unimportant. I was incredulous at this characterization of events. Throughout Mom's illness and after her death, I had repeatedly invited Jessica to participate in caregiving, medical appointments, and funeral planning. Her involvement had been minimal by her own choice, typically due to discomfort with medical environments or emotional difficulty with Mom's condition. The argument revealed deeper resentments that Jessica had apparently been harboring about family dynamics and financial arrangements. She expressed frustration that I had paid for Mom's funeral without family consultation, suggesting that this had been presumptuous and controlling rather than generous and loving. Most disturbing was Jessica's apparent belief that she was entitled to some compensation for the emotional stress of Mom's illness and death, even though she had contributed minimally to Mom's care or support. She seemed to view the money I had spent on funeral expenses as family resources that should have been distributed more equitably, rather than as my personal gift to honor Mom's memory. The conversation ended without resolution, leaving me feeling hurt and bewildered by Jessica's actions and attitudes. Her attempt to reclaim burial expenses felt like a profound betrayal, particularly given the minimal contributions she had made to Mom's care throughout her illness. I decided not to discuss the cemetery incident with Dad, who was still struggling with depression and didn't need additional family conflict during his grief process. Instead, I focused on ensuring the headstone installation proceeded smoothly and that Mom's grave would be properly marked with the memorial we had planned. The incident with Jessica marked a turning point in my understanding of our family dynamics and my own role within them. For years, I had attributed the imbalances in family treatment to different personalities and needs, telling myself that the favoritism I perceived was just a matter of different approaches to supporting different children. However, Jessica's actions regarding the cemetery payments revealed something more troubling about her sense of entitlement and her view of family resources and responsibilities. Her attempt to reclaim money I had spent on Mom's care suggested that she viewed my contributions not as expressions of love and responsibility, but as family funds that should be subject to redistribution according to her preferences. This realization forced me to reconsider many aspects of our family history and to acknowledge that the patterns I had observed were more problematic than I had been willing to admit. The favoritism, financial inequity, and different expectations placed on Jessica and me weren't just matters of different parenting approaches, but reflected deeper issues about entitlement, responsibility, and family values that would have long-term consequences for all of us. 6 months after the cemetery incident, Dad's health took a dramatic turn for the worse. What we had initially attributed to grief-related depression was actually masking a more serious underlying condition. During a routine follow-up appointment, his physician discovered abnormalities in his blood work that prompted immediate additional testing. The diagnosis was devastating. Dad had developed an aggressive form of leukemia that had likely been progressing silently for months while we focused on his emotional recovery from Mom's death. The oncologist explained that his symptoms of fatigue, weight loss, and cognitive changes had been early signs of the cancer rather than purely psychological responses to grief. The treatment protocol was intensive and would require immediate hospitalization, followed by months of chemotherapy. Dad's prognosis was uncertain, depending on how well he responded to treatment and whether the cancer had spread beyond what initial scans could detect. The medical team emphasized that he would need extensive support throughout his treatment journey. Once again, I found myself coordinating Dad's care, meeting with oncologists, reviewing treatment options, and ensuring he understood the complex medical information being presented. The financial implications were staggering, even with his insurance coverage. The specialized treatments, extended hospital stays, and ongoing monitoring would require substantial out-of-pocket expenses. Jessica's response to Dad's cancer diagnosis was emotionally intense, but practically limited. She visited him in the hospital during his initial treatment, bringing flowers and expressing tearful concern about his condition. However, when discussions turned to the logistics of his care, treatment schedules, and financial planning, she quickly became overwhelmed and deferred to my management of these details. I took family medical leave from my job to focus on Dad's care, knowing that the Foundation would hold my position, but understanding that this decision would impact our household income significantly. Michael supported this choice completely, recognizing that Dad needed intensive advocacy and coordination that only I could provide effectively. The chemotherapy treatments were brutal. Dad experienced severe side effects including nausea, extreme fatigue, and increased susceptibility to infections that required careful monitoring and frequent medical interventions. I spent most days at the hospital, ensuring he received proper care, communicating with his medical team, and providing emotional support during his most difficult moments. During this period, I discovered more troubling information about Jessica's financial situation. While organizing Dad's paperwork to manage his medical expenses and insurance claims, I found evidence that she had been receiving far more financial support from our parents than I had realized. Bank statements revealed regular transfers to Jessica's accounts, often for substantial amounts that coincided with her rent payments, car repairs, and various personal expenses. There were also credit card payments that Dad had apparently been making on Jessica's behalf, covering debts she had accumulated through her lifestyle choices. Most concerning was evidence that these financial transfers had continued even after Mom's Alzheimer's diagnosis, when the family should have been conserving resources for her care needs. While I had been contributing my own money to ensure Mom received quality treatment, Dad had simultaneously been supporting Jessica's continued financial dependence. The total amount of money that had been provided to Jessica over the past several years was shocking. It represented tens of thousands of dollars that could have been used for Mom's care, Dad's current medical expenses, or simply preserved for his retirement security. Instead, it had subsidized Jessica's chosen lifestyle without any apparent expectation of repayment or increased independence. When I confronted Dad about these financial arrangements during one of his better days in the hospital, his response was weak and defensive. He acknowledged that he had been supporting Jessica but insisted that she needed help more than I did because of my stable career and marriage. He seemed unable to recognize that his financial support had enabled her continued dependence rather than encouraging self-sufficiency. More troubling was Dad's revelation that Jessica had been pressuring him for additional money even after his cancer diagnosis. She had approached him about covering the security deposit for a larger apartment she and Kyle wanted to rent, apparently viewing his illness as an inconvenience that shouldn't interfere with her housing preferences. I was appalled by Jessica's insensitivity and continued sense of entitlement. While Dad was fighting for his life and facing enormous medical expenses, she was still expecting him to fund her lifestyle improvements. Her behavior demonstrated a level of selfishness that I found difficult to comprehend or forgive. Dad's treatment continued for several months with mixed results. Some aspects of his condition improved with chemotherapy, but the side effects were severe and his overall strength never fully recovered. The medical team adjusted his treatment protocol multiple times, trying to balance effectiveness against his body's ability to tolerate the aggressive medications. Throughout this period, I managed every aspect of Dad's care while Jessica's involvement remained sporadic and superficial. She would visit occasionally, always arriving with emotional displays of concern, but she never stayed long enough to provide practical assistance or to understand the complexity of his medical situation. The financial strain of Dad's treatment was enormous. Despite insurance coverage, the out-of-pocket costs for specialized medications, additional testing, and supportive care services quickly exhausted his savings. I began contributing significantly to his medical expenses, viewing this as both necessary and appropriate given my ability to help and the minimal contributions other family members were making. 8 months after his initial diagnosis, Dad's condition began deteriorating rapidly. The cancer had become resistant to treatment, and his doctors began discussing palliative care options focused on comfort rather than cure. These conversations were heartbreaking but necessary, requiring decisions about end-of-life preferences and family involvement in his final care. I coordinated Dad's transition to hospice care, working with medical social workers to arrange home health services that would allow him to spend his final weeks in familiar surroundings. The house required modifications to accommodate medical equipment and ensure his safety, expenses that I covered while managing the complex logistics of his care team. During Dad's final month, I essentially moved into his house to provide round-the-clock support and ensure he wasn't alone during this difficult time. Michael brought me meals and changes of clothes, understanding that my presence was essential for Dad's comfort and peace of mind. Jessica's visits during Dad's final weeks were brief and uncomfortable. She seemed unable to cope with the reality of his decline and often left abruptly when his condition became apparent or when he needed personal care. Her discomfort with end-of-life situations meant that the responsibility for Dad's emotional and practical support fell entirely on me. Dad passed away on a Tuesday morning in early fall, surrounded by the hospice team and me. His death was peaceful, and I felt grateful that we had been able to provide him with dignity and comfort during his final journey. However, I also felt exhausted and emotionally drained by months of intensive caregiving, combined with grief for both parents within such a short time frame. The process of planning Dad's funeral felt overwhelming given my recent experience with all the decisions and arrangements. However, I knew that Dad deserved the same careful attention to his memorial service that we had provided for Mom. I contacted Morrison Funeral Home again, working with Margaret Collins to plan services that would honor Dad's life and provide closure for family and friends. Dad had expressed preferences for a simple service followed by burial beside Mom at Riverside Cemetery. He had also mentioned wanting his funeral to focus on celebrating his life rather than dwelling on the sadness of his illness. These wishes guided my planning as I coordinated with Father Martinez and selected readings, music, and flowers for the service. Once again, I prepared to cover all funeral expenses, viewing this as my final gift to Dad and a way to ensure he received a dignified memorial. The costs were substantial, but I had anticipated this expense and had been setting aside money specifically for this purpose throughout his illness. 2 days before Dad's scheduled funeral, I received a phone call that changed everything I thought I understood about my family. The caller was attorney David Morrison, who identified himself as the executor of Dad's estate and requested a meeting to discuss his will and final arrangements. I was confused by this call, as Dad had always indicated that I would handle his estate matters given my financial background and involvement in his care. When I mentioned this to attorney Morrison, there was an uncomfortable pause before he explained that Dad had updated his will several months ago, designating Jessica as the primary beneficiary and executor. The meeting with attorney Morrison revealed the full scope of Dad's final betrayal. In a will dated just 2 months after his cancer diagnosis, Dad had left the house, his business assets, and the majority of his financial accounts to Jessica. I was designated to receive a modest monetary bequest, but Jessica was granted control over all major estate decisions, including funeral arrangements. More shocking was a letter Dad had written to accompany the will, explaining his reasoning for these decisions. He wrote that he believed Jessica needed more financial support than I did because of my stable career and marriage. He also expressed concern that I had been too controlling during Mom's illness and his cancer treatment, suggesting that giving Jessica authority over his estate would restore balance to family dynamics. The letter revealed that Jessica had been actively involved in convincing Dad to change his will, arguing that she deserved equal inheritance despite contributing minimally to either parent's care. She had apparently painted my caregiving efforts as attempts to manipulate Dad and gain control over family resources rather than expressions of love and responsibility. Attorney Morrison explained that under the terms of Dad's will, Jessica had the authority to make all decisions about his funeral arrangements, including the budget, service details, and burial plans. As executor, she could override any preparations I had already made and redirect the funeral according to her own preferences. I was devastated by this revelation. After months of caring for Dad through his illness, managing his medical expenses, and preparing to honor his memory with a dignified funeral, I discovered that Jessica had manipulated him into giving her control over everything, while I received minimal recognition for my sacrifices. That evening, Jessica called to inform me of her decisions regarding Dad's funeral. Her tone was businesslike and cold, completely different from the emotional distress she had displayed during his illness. She explained that she had decided to handle all funeral arrangements herself, and that she preferred I not be involved in the planning process. Jessica's vision for Dad's funeral was dramatically different from what he had discussed with me. She wanted a large, elaborate service that would showcase her event planning abilities and demonstrate the family's financial resources. She had selected expensive options for everything from the casket to the flowers, viewing the funeral as an opportunity to impress their social circle rather than simply honor Dad's memory. Most hurtfully, Jessica informed me that she had decided to limit my role in the funeral service itself. She explained that she would be delivering the main eulogy and coordinating all family interactions with guests. She suggested that my presence at the service should be minimal to avoid any confusion about who was in charge of the arrangements. When I attempted to discuss Dad's previously expressed preferences for a simple service, Jessica dismissed these conversations as my interpretation, rather than his actual wishes. She claimed that he had confided different preferences to her and that she was following his true desires, rather than my assumptions about what he wanted. The conversation escalated when I mentioned the substantial financial contributions I had made to Dad's medical care and my intention to cover his funeral expenses as I had done for Mom. Jessica's response was shocking in its coldness and entitlement. She informed me that as executor of Dad's estate, she would be handling all financial matters, including funeral costs. However, she expected me to reimburse the estate for what she characterized as my excessive contributions to Dad's medical care, arguing that these expenses should have been shared equally among family members, rather than paid unilaterally by me. Jessica's demand for reimbursement was particularly galling, given her minimal contributions to either parent's care and her continued receipt of financial support from Dad, even during his illness. She seemed to view my caregiving expenses not as sacrificial gifts to our parents, but as inappropriate expenditures that had depleted family resources she now controlled. When I refused to provide any reimbursement and insisted on maintaining my planned involvement in Dad's funeral, Jessica's response was swift and brutal. She informed me that if I couldn't respect her authority as executor and cooperate with her funeral arrangements, she would prefer that I not attend the service at all. The threat to exclude me from my own father's funeral was so shocking that I initially thought she was making an empty gesture intended to intimidate me into compliance. However, her tone and subsequent actions made it clear that she was entirely serious about denying me access to Dad's memorial service if I didn't submit to her control. Over the next 24 hours, Jessica took steps to formalize my exclusion from Dad's funeral. She contacted Father Martinez to explain that there had been family disagreements about the service and that I would not be attending. She asked him to inform church security that I should not be admitted to the building if I attempted to come to the service. She also contacted Morrison Funeral Home with similar instructions, explaining that my presence would be disruptive and requesting that they deny me access to any funeral activities. Margaret Collins was clearly uncomfortable with these instructions, but felt obligated to follow the wishes of the legal executor even when those wishes seemed inappropriate. The morning of Dad's funeral, I drove to St. Mary's Cathedral despite Jessica's attempts to exclude me. I had helped plan Mom's beautiful service in this same sanctuary, had contributed thousands of dollars to both parents' care, and had devoted months of my life to ensuring they received proper medical attention and emotional support during their final illnesses. Standing outside the church where I had worshipped since childhood, watching mourners enter for my own father's funeral while being denied admission myself, was one of the most surreal and painful experiences of my life. Through the stained glass windows, I could see the elaborate flower arrangements Jessica had selected and catch glimpses of the crowded sanctuary filled with people paying their respects to Dad. Father Martinez emerged from the church about 10 minutes before the service was scheduled to begin. He approached me with obvious discomfort, explaining that he was required to follow the family's instructions about attendance, but that he personally disagreed with my exclusion from the service. During our brief conversation, Father Martinez revealed something that changed my understanding of the entire situation. He explained that when Jessica had contacted him about funeral arrangements, she had been surprised to learn that all expenses for Mom's funeral had been paid in full by me, rather than being shared among family members. Jessica had apparently assumed that funeral costs were automatically covered by the deceased person's estate or shared equally among survivors. Learning that I had personally funded Mom's entire funeral, including expenses that totaled nearly $15,000, had clearly shocked her and influenced her decision to take control of Dad's arrangements. Father Martinez's revelation explained Jessica's subsequent behavior regarding Dad's will and funeral planning. She hadn't simply decided to take charge of family decisions, but had specifically acted to prevent me from making financial contributions that she now understood represented substantial personal generosity rather than normal family obligations. Her manipulation of Dad to change his will and her exclusion of me from his funeral weren't just expressions of sibling rivalry or different approaches to family responsibility. They were calculated attempts to claim control over family resources while preventing me from making additional financial sacrifices that would highlight the disparity in our respective contributions to our parents' care. As Father Martinez returned to the church to begin Dad's funeral service, I stood outside listening to the organ music and opening prayers through the stone walls. The irony of being excluded from a service taking place in a sanctuary where Mom and I had planned countless details for her own funeral was overwhelming. About halfway through the service, I noticed Father Martinez emerging from the church again, this time with a determined expression. He approached me directly and said something that I will never forget for the rest of my life. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I've been thinking about your situation, and I need to ask you something directly. Are you the daughter who paid for your mother's funeral? Because if you are, then you belong inside this church more than anyone else." When I confirmed that I had indeed covered all of Mom's funeral expenses, Father Martinez's expression hardened with what appeared to be anger. He explained that during Dad's funeral service, he had made comments about the importance of family members who sacrifice for others and who demonstrate love through actions rather than words. He had specifically mentioned that some family members show their devotion through financial generosity and personal sacrifice, while others contribute primarily through emotional expressions. These comments had apparently made several people in the congregation uncomfortable, particularly Jessica, who had sent someone to ask him to avoid further references to financial contributions. Father Martinez told me that Jessica's discomfort With his comments, combined with her obvious anxiety about people learning the truth about funeral expenses, had convinced him that my exclusion from the service was inappropriate and possibly motivated by shame or guilt rather than legitimate family conflict. Without waiting for my response, Father Martinez announced that he was suspending the funeral service temporarily to address what he characterized as an important family matter that needed immediate resolution. He returned to the sanctuary, leaving me standing outside in confusion about what was happening. Through the church windows, I could see people turning in their seats and some apparent commotion near the front of the sanctuary where Jessica was seated. Several minutes passed before Father Martinez's voice became audible through the church's sound system as he addressed the congregation directly. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice carried clearly through the stone walls, "I need to pause our service to address something important. We are here today to honor Robert Mitchell, a man who valued family loyalty and sacrifice. However, I've just learned that his daughter, Sarah, who provided extensive care during his illness and who personally funded his wife's entire funeral service, has been excluded from today's gathering." The silence that followed Father Martinez's announcement was deafening. I could hear nothing from inside the church, suggesting that the congregation was stunned by his revelation. When he continued speaking, his tone was firm and disapproving. "I cannot in good conscience continue this service while a family member who demonstrated such devotion to both parents is standing outside this sanctuary. Sarah Mitchell belongs here more than anyone else, and I'm asking her to join us immediately so we can properly honor her father's memory together." The church doors opened, and Father Martinez appeared again, this time extending his hand to escort me into the sanctuary. The congregation was completely silent as I walked down the center aisle, aware that every person present was staring at me and processing the implications of what they had just heard. Jessica's face was pale with what appeared to be either shock or fury as I took a seat in the front pew beside extended family members who welcomed me with obvious relief. Several people whispered expressions of support, and I could see nods of approval throughout the congregation as Father Martinez resumed the service. The remainder of Dad's funeral proceeded normally, but the atmosphere had changed dramatically. Father Martinez's intervention had not only ensured my inclusion in the service, but had also publicly acknowledged the sacrifices I had made for both parents while implicitly criticizing Jessica's attempt to exclude me. During the reception following the burial, numerous people approached me to express appreciation for my care of both parents and to acknowledge the obvious injustice of my initial exclusion from the service. Many had been unaware of the extent of my financial contributions to Mom's funeral and Dad's medical care, and learning these details had clearly influenced their perception of family dynamics. Jessica avoided speaking with me throughout the reception, surrounded by a small group of friends who seemed to be providing emotional support. Several extended family members mentioned that they had been confused by my absence from the beginning of the service and were glad Father Martinez had intervened to correct what they viewed as an inappropriate situation. The contrast between the support I received from extended family and community members versus Jessica's obvious isolation was stark. People who had known our family for decades had clearly observed the patterns of sacrifice and contribution over the years, and my exclusion from Dad's funeral had apparently crystallized their understanding of these dynamics in ways that were unfavorable to Jessica. In the weeks following Dad's funeral, the full implications of Jessica's control over his estate became clear. As executor, she had the authority to distribute assets according to the will's terms, but she also had discretion over various estate decisions that could significantly impact the final distributions. Jessica used this discretion to maximize her own inheritance while minimizing mine. She sold Dad's house quickly to a buyer who offered below market value, rather than investing time in marketing the property properly. She liquidated his business assets at discount prices to facilitate rapid estate closure rather than pursuing optimal returns. These decisions, while legally within her authority as executor, reduced the overall estate value and therefore decreased the modest bequest I was designated to receive. Jessica's approach prioritized speed and convenience over maximizing returns, an approach that clearly benefited her as the primary beneficiary while disadvantaging me as a minor beneficiary. More troubling was Jessica's continued demand that I reimburse the estate for what she characterized as excessive medical expenses I had paid during Dad's illness. She claimed that these expenditures had depleted family resources that should have been preserved for inheritance purposes, and she threatened legal action if I didn't provide compensation. I consulted with my own attorney about Jessica's demands and learned that her threats were legally baseless. My contributions to Dad's medical care had been voluntary gifts that created no obligation for reimbursement, particularly since I had never been asked to provide this support or promised any repayment. However, the attorney also explained that fighting Jessica's estate management decisions would be costly and time-consuming, with uncertain prospects for success. As executor, she had broad discretion over estate administration, and challenging her decisions would require proving that she had acted inappropriately or in bad faith, rather than simply making choices I disagreed with. I decided not to pursue legal action against Jessica's estate management, recognizing that doing so would be expensive, emotionally draining, and unlikely to produce significant financial benefits. Instead, I focused on accepting the inheritance I was designated to receive and moving forward with my own life independent of family dysfunction. The final settlement of Dad's estate provided me with approximately $8,000, a fraction of what I had contributed to both parents' care over the previous several years. Jessica received the house sale proceeds, business assets, and remaining financial accounts, totaling approximately $150,000 after estate expenses and taxes. The disparity in our inheritances was stark, particularly considering our respective contributions to our parents' care and well-being. However, I found peace in knowing that I had honored both Mom and Dad through my actions, regardless of how those actions were ultimately rewarded or recognized. 6 months after Dad's estate was settled, I learned that Jessica and Kyle had used their inheritance to purchase a larger home and new vehicles, essentially treating the money as a windfall for lifestyle upgrades, rather than as a foundation for long-term financial security or a tribute to Dad's memory. Their spending choices highlighted the fundamental differences in our values and approaches to family responsibility. While I had viewed my contributions to our parents' care as expressions of love and duty, Jessica appeared to view the inheritance as compensation for the emotional stress of their illnesses and deaths. Today, 2 years after Dad's death, Michael and I have started the family we had postponed during our parents' illnesses. Our daughter Emma was born last spring, and holding her in my arms reminded me of the values Mom had taught me about putting family needs above personal convenience and demonstrating love through actions rather than just words. I've had no contact with Jessica since Dad's funeral, and I don't expect that to change. The events surrounding our parents' deaths revealed fundamental differences in our characters and values that make ongoing relationship impossible. While this saddens me in some ways, I've found peace in surrounding myself with people who share my commitment to responsibility, generosity, and authentic family bonds. The financial sacrifices I made for Mom and Dad's care represented most of my savings and significantly impacted my own financial security. However, I've never regretted these choices. When I think about their final years, I know they received quality care, dignity, and love during their most vulnerable times, and that knowledge provides comfort that no amount of money could replace. Father Martinez continues to check on me occasionally, and he recently shared that several congregation members have commented on how my actions during our parents' illnesses exemplified the kind of selfless family devotion that their own faith encourages them to practice. These comments remind me that living according to our values has impacts beyond our immediate family circles. Looking back on everything that happened, I realized that being excluded from Dad's funeral was actually a gift in disguise. Father Martinez's intervention not only ensured my inclusion in the service, but also publicly acknowledged the truth about family dynamics that had been hidden or misrepresented for years. His willingness to speak honestly about sacrifice and devotion provided validation that I hadn't realized I needed. The experience taught me that authentic family relationships are built on mutual respect, shared responsibilities, and genuine care for each other's well-being. When these elements are missing, legal relationships and shared history aren't sufficient to create meaningful bonds. Sometimes walking away from dysfunction is the healthiest choice for everyone involved. As I raise my own daughter, I'm committed to teaching her the values Mom instilled in me about compassion, responsibility, and showing love through actions. I also want to ensure she understands that healthy families support each other mutually, rather than creating patterns where one person consistently sacrifices while others consistently receive. The story of my parents' deaths and the aftermath revealed painful truths about family dynamics, entitlement, and the difference between genuine love and manipulative emotional displays. While I wish things had been different, I'm grateful for the clarity these experiences provided about my own values and the kind of relationships I want to prioritize going forward. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.